At the turn of the 20th century, an incurable plague ravaged much of the world. The mysterious disease, known to the world as tuberculosis, claimed entire families, settlements, and towns. Built upon a dark, swampy lowland, Jefferson County, Kentucky, was one such settlement at high risk of tuberculosis infection. To combat the spread of this horrific disease, residents began constructing a new hospital. Thanks to Jefferson County resident efforts, Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened in 1926 with the intent to combat this ravenous disease. Unfortunately, the sanatorium did not live up to its promises, horrifying many county residents with the revelations that released patients divulged. Residents soon discovered the goal of Waverly Hills wasn't finding a cure or even treatment. It was isolation and separation. Patients, including young children, were separated from their families and friends. Contact with the outside world was limited, leading to deaths in isolated and fearful off-limit sections behind locked doors. Residents of the surrounding valley heard screams as the hospital staff dragged patients to dark, sequestered rooms. Even this wasn't the worst fate that Waverly Hills patients faced. Surviving patients recalled unspeakable procedures and supposed cures at Waverly Hills. Around 6,000 deaths took place within the sanatorium before its closure, with reports showing a higher number. But the story doesn't end there. Within this video, you'll uncover the truth behind Waverly Hills Sanatorium, and stick around until the end to uncover the darkest secrets as we uncover the true ghostly haunts of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. The terror caused by tuberculosis was so intense, many patients resorted to whatever treatments promised to save them from the slow, gruesome death to follow. When Waverly Hills doctors presented such a treatment, it seemed inconceivable that it would prove equally as brutal as the disease itself. Patients were torn from their families and then stuffed into small rooms. They were released from their rooms during set hours and remained locked on their assigned floor. Only once their condition improved through treatment were they allowed to leave the facility. This isolation drove many patients mad, leading several to take their own lives. The lucky few who maintained sanity moved on to the next phase of treatment: exposure to open air. Patients were often placed on the hospital's rooftop or balcony. This may sound leisurely to some, but the reality of the situation became plain with the revelation that this practice persisted regardless of weather. Dozens of images and reports depict elderly patients abandoned outdoors in harsh weather. Reports of children held inside sunrooms with temperatures rising over 120 degrees were commonplace too. When this exposure therapy failed, true agony began. Large balloons were inserted into patients' lungs, which were then filled with air. The lungs would overinflate, rupture, and cause the patient to drown in their own bodily fluids. Following this routine failure, patients were subjected to the last resort. During this operation, doctors removed mass amounts of muscle from a patient's chest, followed by several ribs. This experimental operation resulted in internal hemorrhaging, intense bleeding, and finally an excruciatingly prolonged death. Most patients came expecting a cure, but few understood this cure comprised such sadistic experiments. The sheer number of deaths occurring at Waverly Hills forced the development of a new disposal method for the bodies of the deceased. A large tunnel and hauling system was built. The tunnel connected the hospital to the train tracks in the valley below. Throughout the night, staff members gathered the bodies of dead patients in large bundles. These bundles were secretly lowered to the tracks, avoiding other patients. Residents of the valley named this tunnel the body chute. Modern residents claim that on dark nights, the muffled screams of patients lost to the brutal practices of the sanatorium can still be heard echoing from where the body chute once lay. By 1943, tuberculosis infection rates declined, but the gruesome legacy of Waverly Hills persisted, causing the sanatorium to experience a final downward spiral. Infected soldiers returning from World War II received treatment at Waverly Hills. One of the hospital's most prominent practitioners, Dr. Stewart, noted that many of these men seemed to worsen in their condition upon their arrival before dying within a week. 20 years later, in 1962, Waverly Hills continued to uphold its dark legacy as it transitioned into a new purpose as Woodhaven Geriatrics Sanatorium. Claims abounded during this time, and the hospital received multiple citations because of patient mistreatment and malpractice. Despite many such claims being debunked, one remains true. The practice of electroshock therapy was prominent throughout the Woodhaven Geriatrics era, and several elderly patients were electrocuted to death, either through mismanagement or intentional experimentation. As funding continued to decrease through the 60s and 70s, these practices became even more prominent, as it was cheaper and easier to place patients into electroshock therapy or outright ignore them. In 1982, funding dropped one last time. Coupled with the thousands of abuse complaints, the sanatorium closed its doors for good, taking its dark history with it. But this is where things become incredibly eerie. Throughout the late 1900s, Waverly Hills changed hands several times. Each new owner created development plans for the historical site, promising to refurbish the building into such structures as a church or hotel. No plan succeeded, and the sanatorium fell into disrepair by the early 2000s. Urban explorers started infiltrating the grounds, curious why the mystery investors never remodeled or demolished the building. While the explorers searched the sanatorium, ghastly young girls were observed dashing around the third floor. A strange woman donning a wedding dress was witnessed crying out into the night as her wrists dripped blood onto the ground below her fourth-floor balcony. Most visitors reported the flashes of lights through windows and eerie footsteps in the halls. The hospital appeared operational despite being in disrepair. Men wearing white lab coats were often spotted before disappearing without a trace. Tales say these entities behave far more aggressively than their counterparts, often attacking onlookers with long, gnarled fingernails. Just before the ethereal attackers reach their victims, they vanish into the rotting floorboards. Even the hardiest explorers become disturbed by these random, unexplainable encounters. Many outright fled the sanatorium after witnessing these haunting images on the first couple of floors. For the remaining explorers brave enough to stay, far worse encounters await them on the infamous fifth floor. Since its opening in 1926, the fifth floor housed clinically insane and dangerous individuals. These patients were guarded from two adjoining nurse stations, each overlooking one room. It's no surprise to discover that visitors often report seeing the pale faces of patients staring at them through the nurses' station windows, or hear the maniacal laughter of someone within the supply room. Terror strikes those brave enough to traverse this wing, but the true secrets of the fifth floor remain shrouded under the veil of infamous room 502. Nestled between a nurse's station and a decrepit medicine room lies room 502. Here, Waverly Hills' most intense horrors present themselves. In 1928, a young, pregnant attending nurse was found dead inside this room. She was hanged from the ceiling. Some reports claim it took several days before anyone noticed her gruesome situation. Unable to determine what led to the nurse's untimely death, the case was closed. In the years following, staff and patients alike would claim to hear whispers within the room, driving them mad with anxiety. The insanity reached its climax a few years later. In 1932, another young nurse was cleaning room 502's windows. Witnesses claim they heard a scream from within the room, followed by a strange stretching sound, similar to a rope pulling taut. One patient claimed he opened the door just in time to witness the young nurse staggering onto the balcony, as if trying to catch her breath. The next event he witnessed remains unexplained. A pair of hands materialized and forcefully pushed the nurse off the balcony. She fell 4 stories to her death on the ground below. The ghostly haunts of this floor often manifest to visitors as floating orbs, visages in the windows, and sometimes full-bodied silhouettes that dash between rooms. Room 502 often echoes with violent shrieks and creaking, revealing an empty room upon inspection. On other occasions, Visitors have entered 502, wherein the door behind them slams shut and icy fingers caress their backs. Upon approaching the balcony, whispers of a mad woman find their way into some visitors' ears, causing them to attempt jumping off the balcony only to stop at the last moment. Many ghost hunters and psychics consider visiting the 5th floor their scariest experience. Just who or what continues to inhabit Waverly Hills? Despite vast efforts to identify the various spirits in the sanatorium, none have been successful. Some experts cite the overwhelming amount of spiritual energy within the building as a contributing factor to the difficulty in identifying individual entities. Other more analytical types have said the grounds themselves feel desecrated and dark. Despite several efforts to revive the building as part of preservation efforts, all attempts have failed. Construction crews encountered odd blockages within the building itself. Outright demolition appears unlikely because of the sanatorium's hilltop position and inaccessible foundation. The facts irrefutably suggest that tortured and corrupt souls are behind the hauntings at the Hilltop Hospital. Local hauntings strike fear into visitors, but even more terrifying than spectral threats or ghastly figures is the historically true era that birthed Waverly Hills. Before the advent of modern medicine, 1/7 of the world's population died from tuberculosis annually. This mystery illness could eradicate entire families within days. Towns, villages, and cities alike were burned and destroyed to stop its spread. One unfortunate soldier coughing up blood could annihilate an entire army. Many feared this bloody fate was far worse than hospitalization, mistreatment, or premature death. In some ways, the most terrifying aspect of Waverly Hills isn't so much its resident ghosts, but the legacy of the millions left dead in the path of this ravenous disease, doomed to walk this earth as shells of their former selves as they withered away. So if you ever wander near the shadowy silhouette of Waverly Hills, remember this. Amidst its decrepit hallways and moldy walls, it's not just the ghosts of the past that call out in the night, but the chilling whispers of human mortality itself. What do you think the scariest aspect of Waverly Hills Sanatorium is? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, watch our previous video on the Salem witch trials to delve deeper into human brutality, or use the link in the description below.